The words came like a thunderclap through the corridors of the hospital. The war is over. You're going home. For months, the American prisoners had clung to that hope, their minds wandering endlessly to porches back in Ohio, wheat fields in Kansas, or crowded streets in New York City. James Whitaker sat upright on his cot, the rough wool blanket sliding from his shoulders. At 24, he had endured years of captivity, yet the announcement struck him like a dream he was afraid to wake from. Around him, men shouted, laughed, and cried. One man fell to his knees in prayer, another hugged the nearest comrade as if afraid to let go. James only sat still, absorbing the words as though they might evaporate if he moved too quickly. He thought of his mother, who had once sent letters folded so neatly he could almost smell the flour-dusted kitchen back home. He thought of his father, who had worked the land even as arthritis bent his hands. To return to them was more than freedom, it was restoration. Before we continue, if you want to hear more untold stories of survival, resilience, and humanity during history's darkest moments, make sure to subscribe to this channel. These voices from the past deserve to be remembered, and your support keeps them alive. The hospital itself was no triumph of architecture. It had once been a schoolhouse in Bavaria, its walls cracked from bomb tremors, the windows patched with cardboard and cloth. Beds were nothing more than straw mattresses on iron frames, lined up with military precision. Supplies were scarce. Every bandage was boiled and reused, every bottle of medicine stretched to the last drop. But here, at least, the men were fed, treated, and shielded from the chaos beyond. James had learned to respect the nurses, German women who carried themselves with quiet resilience. Anna Vogel stood out among them, not for her beauty, though her calm eyes lingered in memory, but for the firmness of her voice when she ordered soldiers twice her size to obey her instructions. She dressed wounds without complaint, whispered words of comfort in accented English, and sometimes offered the rare smile that reminded the prisoners they were still human beings, not just bodies marked by war. Now, as freedom loomed, the air carried more than joy. It carried whispers. James overheard two nurses speaking in hurried tones near the stairwell. "They believe they are safe outside," one said, "but it is worse out there than they know." The other nodded grimly, her gaze flicking toward the jubilant Americans. "Better they stay here. We cannot tell them too much. They will not believe us." The words gnawed at James's thoughts. He wanted to dismiss them as remnants of German defeatism, but the tone unsettled him. He recalled the rare glimpses he'd had of the countryside beyond the hospital walls. Villages reduced to ashes, fields trampled into mud, columns of refugees dragging carts piled with scraps of life. Victory had ended the fighting, yes, but had it brought peace? A fellow prisoner slapped James on the shoulder, grinning wide. "Can you believe it, Whitaker? We're going home." His eyes gleamed with hunger for reunion, for normalcy. James forced a smile in return, but something in his chest felt heavy, as if the promise of home was wrapped in uncertainty. That night, the barracks echoed with laughter and plans. Men spoke of train rides, parades, warm meals, and women waiting at docks and stations. James listened, but his thoughts drifted to the nurses' whispers. Why would they say the outside world was dangerous now that the guns had gone silent? Sleep was slow to come. He lay staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the soft shuffle of footsteps in the corridor, the distant cough of a sick man, the faint whistle of wind through broken panes. Freedom was calling, yet doubt settled in his bones. The war was over, they were told. But if the war was truly finished, why did those who had lived through it seem so certain that safety was not beyond the hospital walls, but within them? The morning would bring orders for departure. James closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow his choice would not simply be to leave, but to face the truth of what lay beyond. The following morning broke grey and heavy, the Bavarian sky covered with clouds that seemed to press down on the crumbling rooftops. The hospital yard filled with restless energy, as word spread that preparations were being made for the prisoners' departure. Men gathered their meager belongings, a pair of boots held together with twine, letters folded so many times the ink had faded, a photograph kept in a pocket through years of captivity. For most, these fragments of life were enough to carry the hope of return. James Whittaker tightened the laces of his boots, the leather stiff from months of wear. His heart wanted to leap with the others, yet the memory of the whispered warning clung to him. He kept looking toward the nurses, hoping to catch a glance, a sign that what he had overheard was only the tired worry of defeated women. But Anna Vogel was there, her calm eyes fixed on the departing preparations, and when James finally met her gaze, she shook her head almost imperceptibly, as though urging him to pause. Later, as he carried a sack of bedding down the corridor, he found Anna waiting near the stairwell. Her voice was low, her English careful. "You are leaving tomorrow, yes?" "That's what they tell us," James answered, trying to sound confident, though unease crept into his tone. She looked down the hall to be sure no one was listening. "The roads are not safe. There is no food. Villages are angry, frightened. People are desperate. Out there, no uniform protects you." James shifted the sack in his arms. "But the war's over. We'll reach Allied lines, it's only a matter of time." Anna's lips pressed into a thin line. "Time is dangerous now. Too many are wandering, displaced, starving, armed. They take from anyone." The weight of her words was heavier than the sack he carried. He wanted to argue, to insist that going home was the only path forward, but the seriousness in her eyes silenced him. That night, as the men ate thin broth and stale bread, the room buzzed with anticipation. "First thing tomorrow we'll be on the road west," said Corporal Miller, slapping his knee with excitement. "By next week I'll be eating steak in Chicago." "Don't kid yourself," another replied. "It'll take longer, but at least we'll be free, that's all that matters." James listened, but spoke little. His thoughts lingered on Anna's words. He noticed, too, that the nurses moved about quietly, avoiding the prisoners' conversations. Their silence carried its own weight. When the lights dimmed, James lay awake, staring at the beams above his cot. Around him, men whispered of wives, children, and plans for when they stepped once more onto American soil. Yet James's mind kept returning to the cracked roads he had glimpsed through the fences, the hollow faces of civilians who lined up for rations. Was freedom just a march away, or a trial through a wasteland none of them were ready to face? In the early hours, he stepped outside into the cool air. The courtyard smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from nearby ruins. Anna stood near the gate, her cloak pulled tight. She did not look surprised to see him. "You do not believe me," she said softly. James rubbed his hands together for warmth. "I want to, but I can't tell the men not to leave. They've held on for years, waiting for this day." "I understand," Anna replied, "but remember, safety is not always where the road leads. Sometimes it is where you already stand." Her words settled deep within him, like stones sinking into water. He returned inside, uncertain, carrying with him both the promise of home and the first shadows of doubt. By dawn, the men were lined up, ready for orders. Cheers erupted as the guards announced preparations to move west, yet James's heart did not rise with theirs. Instead, he felt the pull of two opposing truths, the joy of freedom ahead and the quiet warning of danger whispered behind. The prisoners spent the day preparing for departure, though the mood in the hospital grew strangely divided. Some men laughed louder than usual, their excitement spilling over in boasts about the meals waiting back home. Others, like James, moved more quietly, haunted by the lingering weight of the nurses' warnings. He noticed how Anna and her colleagues avoided the men's enthusiasm, keeping their eyes on their work as if celebration was a luxury they could not afford. During the afternoon, James was tasked with carrying buckets of water from the pump outside. Anna joined him, her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with a rag that had once been white. They worked in silence at first, the only sound the slosh of water and the creak of wooden handles. Finally, Anna spoke. "You think I try to frighten you," she said without looking up. James paused, the bucket heavy in his hands. "I think you're trying to tell me something no one else wants to admit." She straightened, her gaze meeting his. "In Nuremberg, whole streets are gone. Families dig through rubble for food. Children eat grass. Women trade whatever they can for bread, and that is only the beginning." Her words were steady, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. James imagined his own sister in such conditions and felt his stomach twist. "You've seen it yourself?" he asked. Anna nodded. I grew up near Dresden. My parents are gone. My brother has not returned. When I say the roads are dangerous, it is not rumor. It is memory. James carried the bucket back inside, his mind churning. The other prisoners teased him for working alongside the nurse. "Careful, Whitaker," one joked. "Don't go falling for the enemy." The laughter stung, but James brushed it off, unwilling to share what Anna had told him. Later that evening, Anna found him again, this time while distributing bandages. She handed him a strip of cloth, her fingers brushing his. "You must understand," she whispered. "The Americans are not hated here, but hunger makes enemies of everyone. Soldiers, civilians, it makes no difference. Desperation changes people." James studied her face, pale from long nights without rest. "Why tell me all this? Why not let us go and be rid of us?" Anna hesitated, then answered quietly. "Because you remind me of my brother. And because I know what waits outside." Her confession struck James more deeply than he expected. For years he had defined the world in sharp lines, allies and axis, friend and foe, right and wrong. Yet here was Anna, a woman who by all rights should have been an enemy, speaking to him as if they were kin. That night James could not sleep. The barracks rang with men's laughter and hopeful talk, but he lay awake, listening to the faint murmur of nurses in the corridor. He caught fragments of their German, words for hunger, fear, and ruin. The walls between us and them blurred in the darkness, leaving him with the uneasy realization that suffering knew no nationality. The following morning, James saw Anna tending to an elderly local woman who had come seeking help. The woman's shoes were worn to rags, her face hollow, her hands trembling as she reached for the bread Anna offered. Watching this, James felt a pang of shame. The men spoke of homecomings, of banquets and parades, yet the people outside these walls had no such promises. When Anna noticed him, she offered a small, weary smile. In that moment, James felt a strange bond forming, a fragile thread that tied their lives together, however briefly. She was not a nurse of the enemy, nor he a prisoner of war. They were simply two souls caught in the wreckage of a world at war, searching for some measure of safety. But the departure loomed closer, and with it the question he could not escape. Would he follow the road to freedom, or heed the warnings of the woman who had shown him humanity in the unlikeliest of places? The orders came at dawn. A German officer, his uniform frayed and his face hollow from exhaustion, stepped into the hospital yard with two Allied representatives at his side. The men gathered quickly, their breaths visible in the cool morning air. The officer's voice cracked as he announced, "Tomorrow you will begin your march west. The roads are open. You will be escorted to Allied lines." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then an eruption of cheers filled the yard. Some clapped each other on the back, others lifted their arms skyward as if praising heaven itself. The long-awaited words had finally arrived, spoken with authority and certainty. James Whitaker tried to join in, forcing a smile as men around him whooped with joy, but the unease that had been building in his chest refused to vanish. Corporal Miller shouted above the noise, "We're going home, boys. By this time next week it's steak and bourbon for me." His grin was so wide it almost looked painful. The others laughed, clinging to his enthusiasm like a lifeline. Not everyone shared in the celebration. Sergeant Connors, older and worn from years of hardship, muttered to James, "It won't be so easy. You don't move this many men through a broken country without trouble." "Mark my words." James nodded slowly. Connors's skepticism echoed his own thoughts, though he said nothing. He caught Anna's figure at the edge of the crowd. She stood with her arms folded, her eyes downcast. Unlike the prisoners, she did not cheer. When their gazes met, she gave the faintest shake of her head before turning back toward the building. That small gesture gnawed at him through the day. While men polished their boots, tightened belts, and traded promises of reunion, James drifted through preparations in silence. Every corner of the hospital seemed to hold traces of what Anna had told him, the hushed warnings, the quiet plea to listen. Later, he found her in the corridor, stacking folded sheets. "So it's decided," he said, his voice lower than he intended. Anna looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Yes, you will leave tomorrow." "You don't think it's the right decision," James said, searching her face for answers. her hand stilled over the sheets. "It is not my place to decide for you, but I have seen what lies outside. I cannot cheer for it." James leaned against the wall, conflicted. "You think we should stay here?" "As prisoners," she shook her head. "Not prisoners, survivors. Here you have food, shelter, medicine. Out there, all of that is gone. Men like you, strong, disciplined, you will be targets." Her words dug deeper than he wanted to admit. He thought of the men laughing in the yard, of their fragile hope. To speak Anna's warnings aloud would make him an enemy among his own. That evening, the tension among the prisoners revealed itself. Arguments broke out in the barracks, some men eager to leave, others voicing concerns about the journey. "We'll be walking into a graveyard," one muttered. "Better a graveyard than a cage," another snapped back. James stayed quiet, listening, his thoughts twisting. He longed for home more than anything, but what if the path to it led through ruin? As the lamps burned low, Sergeant Connors sat beside James and whispered, "You've been talking with the nurses. They know something, don't they?" James hesitated before answering. "They say it's worse out there than we realize." Connors gave a grim chuckle. "I figured as much. The others won't believe it, though. They've been dreaming of home too long." James lay back on his cot, the ceiling beams blurred by shadows. Tomorrow, they would march. He could not stop it, nor could he silence the voice inside that asked if freedom on paper was the same as freedom on the road. The night stretched long, filled with restless shifting, whispered prayers, and the clatter of boots being readied for departure. As dawn approached, James closed his eyes, knowing the moment of decision was no longer far away. The prisoners marched out at sunrise, their boots striking the ground in uneven rhythm. The air was cold and damp, carrying the acrid scent of smoke that seemed permanent in the Bavarian countryside. James Whittaker kept pace among the men, his pack slung over his shoulder, his eyes drifting constantly to the horizon. The excitement that had filled the barracks the night before now mingled with unease, every step pressing them deeper into the unknown. They passed through villages scarred beyond recognition. Houses lay in ruins, walls blackened by fire, roofs collapsed into piles of ash and broken tiles. In doorways stood civilians with hollow cheeks and wary eyes. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, their faces smeared with soot and hunger. James caught the gaze of one boy, no older than 10, his eyes too tired for his age. The boy raised a hand, not in greeting but in silent plea. James shifted his pack uncomfortably, unable to meet the stare for long. The men's chatter began to fade as the landscape told its own story. "God Almighty," muttered Corporal Miller, his earlier bravado dulled. "Looks like hell burned straight through here." Sergeant Connors walked beside James, his jaw tight. "This is what victory looks like. Don't let the officers fool you. It won't be parades and confetti all the way home." As they advanced, the smell of charred wood mixed with something more bitter, the stench of rot. In one yard, a horse lay dead, ribs protruding, flies swarming over its carcass. A prisoner gagged and turned his head, while another whispered, "If this is the beginning, what's waiting further on?" James's mind kept circling back to Anna's words. Better they stay here. He had thought her fears were born from defeat, but now the ruins themselves seemed to confirm her warning. The countryside was not a path to freedom, but a graveyard of survival. At midday, the men were allowed to rest near a stream. Some splashed water onto their faces, others dipped tin cups to drink. A group of villagers appeared at the edge of the trees, thin, ragged figures, their clothes patched with whatever scraps they could find. They did not approach but stood watching, eyes fixed on the bread the prisoners carried. One woman whispered something to another, her voice desperate though too soft to understand. Miller tore a piece of bread from his ration and tossed it toward them. The villagers scrambled for it, fighting with a ferocity that silenced the soldiers. James stared as two men wrestled in the mud for a single crust. Finally, one snatched it away, clutching it to his chest like treasure. "They're starving," James murmured. Connors nodded grimly. "And we're marching through their land with food in our packs. Don't think they won't notice." When the march resumed, the prisoners moved more quietly. The earlier excitement was gone, replaced by the heavy realization that the world outside the hospital walls was broken in ways they had not imagined. Every ruined house, every gaunt face drove the truth deeper. The war might be over, but peace had not arrived. As evening approached, they entered another village. The church steeple leaned precariously, half the houses reduced to rubble. A group of old men sat on a stone wall, their eyes following the column of prisoners with unreadable expressions. A dog barked weakly, ribs showing through its fur. James felt a chill, not from the air but from the silence of the people watching them pass. Miller tried to lift the mood. "Once we hit Allied lines, it'll all be behind us," he said loudly, as if trying to convince himself. James forced a nod but remained silent. Inside, doubt grew heavier with every step. Freedom was closer in miles, yet further in certainty. As the men bedded down in the ruins of a barn that night, James lay awake, staring into the darkness, haunted by the boy's eyes, the fighting villagers, and the bitter smoke that clung to his clothes. The road to home was not paved with celebration, it was lined with ashes. The second day on the road began with a bitter chill and the gnawing ache of empty stomachs. The men had been given only small rations, hard bread and a thin strip of dried meat, barely enough to quiet their hunger. By midday, the bread was gone, and the men's steps slowed, their shoulders slumping under the weight of fatigue. James Whittaker chewed the last piece of crust until it dissolved into nothing, his jaw working, though there was little left to swallow. Around him, men muttered complaints, their voices sharp with irritation born of hunger. "They call this rations," one soldier growled. "This is a joke." Corporal Miller, still clinging to optimism, forced a grin. "Don't worry, boys. Once we link up with the Allies, we'll be eating like kings." But the laughter that followed was hollow, brittle. Sergeant Connors, trudging beside James, shook his head. "Food doesn't come easy, even for the victors. Don't fool yourself. The whole continent's starving." As the sun rose higher, the men's tempers frayed. A scuffle broke out when one soldier accused another of stealing from his pack. The two grappled in the dust until guards intervened, their voices harsh in German. The fight ended, but the suspicion lingered. Every man began to watch his neighbor more closely, clutching his pack as though it contained gold. James felt the tension like a storm building around him. Hunger made men dangerous, stripping away patience and brotherhood. That night they camped in the ruins of a farmhouse, its walls half collapsed, its roof gone. The wind howled through the broken beams as the men huddled together, stomachs growling louder than their conversations. In the corner, Miller whispered to James, "You believe what those nurses said? About it being safer back there?" James hesitated, staring into the shadows. "I don't know what to believe. But look around you. This doesn't feel like safety." Miller sighed, his optimism flickering. "I keep thinking of my mother's kitchen. She'd bake bread every Saturday, the smell filling the whole street. I swear I can taste it when I close my eyes." His voice cracked, and James felt a pang of sympathy. Hunger was no longer just in their bellies. It was invading their minds, turning memories into torment. The next morning, desperation deepened. A few men searched the rubble of nearby homes, hoping for scraps. One returned triumphant with a potato, shriveled and half-rotten. But it was devoured in moments. Another man found a chicken carcass stripped bare, gnawed at it until the others pulled it from his hands in disgust. "God help us," Connors muttered. "We're losing ourselves already." James tried to steady his own resolve, but the hunger pressed in like a weight on his chest. He remembered Anna's face, the warning in her voice. Here you have food, shelter, medicine. Out there, all of that is gone. Her words echoed in his mind, louder with each pang of emptiness in his stomach. By evening, the men's unity fractured further. Whispers spread that the guards carried better food, that some prisoners were hoarding scraps. The atmosphere grew dangerous, eyes flashing with suspicion. James felt the unease crawl under his skin. He had survived years of war and captivity, but this slow erosion of strength and trust, felt more threatening than any battle. When night fell, he lay awake on the cold floor of the farmhouse ruins. The wind carried the faint cries of villagers somewhere beyond, voices desperate in the darkness. Hunger was everywhere, not just within their group. Closing his eyes, James tried to silence his thoughts, But one question gnawed at him as relentlessly as the emptiness in his stomach. If this was only the beginning of their journey, how much worse would it become before they reached the promise of home? The third day on the march dawned with a red sky, streaked as though the horizon itself still bled from the war. The men's steps were slower now, dragged down by fatigue and hunger. James Whittaker walked in silence, his throat dry, his thoughts circling endlessly around the same fear. If the road already looked this grim, what lay ahead? By mid-morning they reached a larger town. The streets bore scars of bombing, walls shattered, roofs caved in, windows gaping like broken teeth. Smoke still lingered from fires set days, perhaps weeks earlier. Yet unlike the abandoned villages they had passed before, this place pulsed with human presence. Civilians crowded the square, their faces grim, their voices sharp. At first, James thought it was a market. Then he saw the man in the center, his hands bound, his head bowed, another prisoner, though not one of theirs. He was a German in civilian clothes, surrounded by a mob. Shouts filled the air, accusations of betrayal, of collaboration. Stones flew from the crowd, striking the man until he staggered. James froze, his stomach churning. "What are they doing?" he whispered. Sergeant Connors answered grimly. "Settling scores, it's happening all over. People are hungry, angry. Anyone accused of siding with the Nazis, this is what they get." The mob grew louder, surging forward. A woman spit at the bound man, screaming words James couldn't fully understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. Her face twisted with fury, her fists trembling as she struck him again and again. One of the American prisoners muttered, "We can't just stand here." But Connors gripped his arm. "Don't be a fool, this isn't our fight. Step in and you'll be the next target." James felt torn in two. Every instinct screamed to intervene, to stop the beating before it turned fatal. Yet he saw the mob's eyes, wild with rage and grief, and knew Connors was right. They were outsiders here, vulnerable and despised. Any move would only draw the storm onto themselves. The guards barked orders, trying to push the column forward, but the men couldn't look away. James caught sight of a boy no older than 12, hurling stones with all the strength his thin arms could muster. The image seared into James's mind, a child already taught that revenge was survival. Finally, the mob dragged the accused man toward the edge of the square. The crowd's roar swelled, drowning out everything else. James forced himself to turn away, his chest tight, his hands clenched until his nails dug into his palms. He didn't know what became of the man, and part of him wished he never would. When the column moved on, silence hung heavy over the prisoners. Even Miller, usually quick with jokes or hopeful talk, said nothing. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. After some time, James spoke quietly to Connors. "How do people come back from this? How do you build anything again when all that's left is hatred?" Connors's voice was low, rough. "You don't. Not for a long time, maybe not ever." The words lingered as they left the town behind. James couldn't shake the sight of the boy in the crowd, his small face hardened with rage. War had ended, but something darker had taken root, something that might last far longer than battles or bombs. As night fell, the men lay in another ruined barn, their bodies weak, their minds unsettled. Hunger gnawed at them, but so did something else now. The realization that peace was not what waited on the horizon. Instead, shadows of revenge haunted the land, threatening to consume everything in their path. James closed his eyes, but the sounds of the mob still echoed in his ears. Freedom, home, safety, all of it felt further away than ever. The march stretched on, each day blending into the next, a rhythm of aching feet and hollow stomachs. The men spoke less now, their strength hoarded for walking. James Whittaker trudged at the center of the column, his eyes scanning the ruined countryside, his thoughts looping back to the same uneasy refrain. Was Anna right? Rumors began to ripple through the group like sparks in dry grass. One man swore he'd overheard guards speaking of other prisoners, columns that had set out west only to vanish, cut down by roving bands or caught in riots. Another claimed Allied soldiers had been ambushed before reaching their own lines. The truth was impossible to pin down, yet the uncertainty itself became poison. At night, When the prisoners gathered in barns or by smouldering campfires, whispers carried. "We should turn back," one man muttered. "At least in the hospital we had food." Another snapped, "Turn back to what? To be locked up again?" James listened but did not speak. His silence made him a magnet. Men began to ask his opinion, their voices urgent, almost pleading. "What do you think, Whitaker?" "You've got a good head. Should we keep going?" He hesitated each time, torn between loyalty to his comrades and the echo of Anna's voice. The weight of their trust pressed heavily on him. One evening, Sergeant Connors cornered him after the others had drifted to sleep. "You've heard the talk," Connors said, his voice low. "The men look to you. They trust you more than they trust the officers now. That's dangerous unless you're ready to lead." James rubbed his temples, exhausted. "I don't want to lead, I just want to get home." Connors studied him for a long moment. "That's exactly why they'll listen to you. You speak plain, not like someone trying to command." The pressure tightened around James's chest. He thought of Anna again, of her weary eyes, her warning that survival was not on the open road, but within the walls they had left behind. He wished he could dismiss her words, but every mile only made them ring truer. The following day, the column passed through another village. This one bore fewer scars, but the people were no kinder. A group of men blocked their path for a tense moment, their faces hard, their hands gripping tools that could just as easily be weapons. Only when the guards barked orders and pushed the prisoners forward did the villagers reluctantly step aside. The hostility in their eyes lingered long after. That night, tempers finally cracked. A group of prisoners confronted the officer leading them, demanding to know how much farther, demanding better rations, demanding certainty. The officer shouted back in broken English, insisting they were close to Allied lines. His words did little to calm them. Miller pulled James aside afterward, his voice desperate. "We can't keep going like this. Men are dropping. The villagers hate us. The guards don't care if we starve. If we push farther, we'll end up like those rumors say, dead on the road." James swallowed hard. "What are you suggesting?" "Go back," Miller whispered. "You heard the nurses. You saw what we had there. It wasn't perfect, but at least it was safe." James wanted to argue, but Miller's eyes, once full of reckless optimism, now burned with fear. And James could not deny he shared it. When he lay down to sleep, James felt the weight of two paths pressing against him. One led westward, toward the promise of home, but through a wasteland of hunger and hostility. The other curved back toward the hospital, toward the enemy who had shown him kindness, toward survival at the cost of freedom. The men would soon demand a decision. And when they did, James knew he would have no choice but to answer. The march pressed on into the fourth day, each mile carving away what little strength remained in the prisoners' bodies. James Whitaker trudged with the others, his legs heavy, his stomach hollow. The road stretched before them like an endless wound across the land, flanked by ruined fields and hollow-eyed villagers who watched in silence. By late afternoon, the column entered another settlement. Unlike the small villages they had seen before, this town had once been large. Now it was a skeleton of stone and ash. Roofless buildings leaned like drunks, windows shattered, doors ripped from their hinges. The smell hit first, a mix of damp wood, smoke, and something sourer, like rot buried beneath rubble. As the prisoners filed through the main street, the silence shattered. From an alley, a group of desperate civilians surged forward, eyes wild, hands grasping. They went straight for the prisoners' packs, clawing at them with frantic strength. "Food!" one man cried in German, his voice breaking. "Give us food!" The guards shouted, shoving them back, but more came. A woman snatched at Miller's bag, pulling until the strap tore. Miller struck her arm instinctively, but she only lunged again, her face twisted with hunger. Another prisoner fell as two boys yanked at his boots. Chaos exploded around them, shouts mixing with cries of desperation. James swung his pack away from grasping hands, his heart hammering. The crowd wasn't an enemy force. It was civilians, starved and broken, their humanity stripped by need. Yet in their eyes, James saw the same ferocity he'd faced on the battlefield. "Keep moving!" Connors barked, pulling James forward. "We stay, we're dead men!" The guards beat back the mob with rifle butts, but the blows did little to scatter them. James saw Miller wrestling with a man twice his size, both clutching the same loaf of bread. For a moment, James thought Miller would strike him down. Instead, Miller let go, stumbling backward as the man tore away with the bread clutched to his chest like treasure. By the time the prisoners broke free onto the far side of town, their column was scattered, battered, shaken. Several men carried bruises and cuts. One limped badly from a twisted ankle. Miller's face was pale, his hands trembling as he muttered, "They weren't soldiers. They were just hungry." No one answered. The truth hung in the air heavier than any words. When they stopped for the night, the men huddled in silence. Even the usual whispers of home were gone. James sat apart, staring into the darkness, his mind replaying the desperation in those faces. Anna's warning echoed louder than ever. Here you have food, shelter, medicine. Out there, all of that is gone. Connors settled beside him, his expression grim. "This road will kill us, Whitaker. Not with bullets, but with hunger and chaos. The men know it too. They're waiting for someone to say it out loud." James rubbed his face, torn between duty and survival. "If we turn back, we'll be branded cowards." Connors's reply was sharp. "Better a live coward than a dead fool." Nearby, Miller broke his silence, his voice shaking. "She was right, wasn't she? The nurse, Anna. She warned us. We should have listened." James looked at him, at all of them, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They had dreamed of home, but home was still an ocean away. Here, survival was no dream. It was a choice. That night, as the men tried to rest in the cold ruins, James lay awake, staring at the black sky. His body ached, his stomach churned, but it was the weight of decision that pressed hardest. Ahead was freedom promised, but not certain. Behind was captivity, redefined as safety. The march had begun with cheers. Now it dragged with silence. And soon, James knew, silence would break into something far harder to face. The choice between continuing forward into ruin or turning back toward the very walls they had once prayed to leave. By the fifth morning, the prisoners no longer looked like men marching to freedom. Their clothes hung loose from hunger, their eyes dulled by exhaustion. Each step was a test of willpower, and the silence among them felt heavier than their packs. James Whitaker walked near the front, his mind burning with the memory of the mob in the ruined town. The cries of starving civilians haunted him more than any battlefield ever had. It was Miller who finally gave voice to what everyone felt. "We can't keep this up," he said as they rested by the side of the road. His hands trembled as he tried to untie his boots. "Another week like this, and half of us won't make it." A murmur spread through the group. Some nodded, others shook their heads violently. One soldier snapped, "So what's your plan? Crawl back to the Germans and beg for scraps?" "I'd rather die on the road than go back to captivity." "That wasn't captivity," Miller shot back. "We had beds, we had food, we had medicine. Out here we've got nothing but graves waiting for us." The argument lit a fire in the men. Voices rose, sharp with anger and fear. "You want to go back? Then go," one prisoner spat. "But don't drag the rest of us with you." Connors stepped in, his voice steady but grim. "Listen to yourselves. We're tearing apart before the enemy even fires a shot. Look around you. This isn't a march, it's a death sentence." James stood apart, watching the division deepen. His stomach knotted. Both sides were right and both sides were wrong. Going forward promised only more hunger and danger. Turning back meant surrendering the freedom they had longed for. The officer leading them tried to restore order, shouting in German for silence, but the men no longer listened. Their loyalty had shifted, not to rank, but to survival. That night, in the ruins of another barn, the whispers turned to open plans. A group of men approached James directly, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. Miller was among them. "You've seen it, Whitaker," he said, his voice hoarse. "You know what's waiting on this road. Help us lead the others back. They'll follow you." James swallowed hard, the firelight reflecting in his tired eyes. "And what about the ones who still believe in pressing on? They'll call us deserters." "They'll call us alive," Miller countered. "That's worth more than any name." Connors joined them, his tone firm. The column's breaking, Whitaker. By morning men will choose their own paths whether you speak or not. Better you step up and give them direction than let them scatter like frightened sheep. James stared at the group around him. Their faces were lined with hunger, their eyes hollow, but in them he saw something else too. Trust. They were looking to him for a decision. When morning came, the division was undeniable. Half the men packed their things, muttering about continuing west. The others lingered, waiting for someone to speak the words they couldn't. James stepped forward, his heart pounding. We all want the same thing, to live long enough to see home again. But look at where the road has brought us. Look at what it's taken already. We've got a choice now. Press on into ruin, or turn back to where we had food and shelter. It won't be easy either way, but standing here won't save us. Silence followed, broken only by the caw of crows circling above. Then Miller raised his hand. I'm going back. Anyone who wants to live should come with us. The group split before James's eyes, lines drawn not by rank or nationality, but by desperation. Some turned west, clinging to the hope of Allied lines. Others, including James, gathered their few belongings and began the march back toward the place they had once dreamed of leaving forever. The road forward had promised freedom. The road back promised survival, and James knew with every step he took in reverse that nothing would ever be the same again. The march back felt different. The same road that had once carried hope now carried shame and relief in equal measure. James Whitaker led the smaller band of prisoners eastward, their steps slow but steadier than before. Behind him, Miller walked silently, his face drawn, while Connors kept a wary eye on the horizon. None of them spoke much. It was as if words themselves were too heavy to carry. The landscape looked no kinder in reverse. The ruins were the same, the villages just as hollow, but knowing they were heading toward shelter gave each man a faint reserve of strength. James felt it too, though it came mixed with guilt. He wondered what his father would say if he saw him now, turning back toward a German camp instead of pressing on toward freedom. When the hospital finally came into sight, a low murmur ran through the group. The building stood weathered but familiar, its patched windows and cracked walls strangely comforting. The guards at the gate looked startled as the men approached. One barked a question in German, his rifle half raised. James raised his hands, calling out in a steady voice, "We've come back." The guard hesitated, then lowered his weapon. The gates opened slowly, creaking on their hinges. Inside, the nurses hurried forward, their faces a mix of surprise and recognition. James caught sight of Anna among them, her expression softened, relief flickering across her tired features. "You returned," she said when he reached her, her voice low but steady. James nodded, exhaustion pulling at every muscle. "You were right. Out there, it's worse than we imagined." Anna studied the men behind him, their gaunt faces, their torn boots, their hollow eyes. She gave a small nod. "You will be safe here, at least for now." The men were led back into the familiar corridors. Beds had been prepared, thin blankets folded neatly. The smell of boiled soup drifted from the kitchen. Some of the men nearly wept at the sight of bowls placed in their hands. Miller sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the steam rising from his soup as though it were a vision from another world. "I can't believe I ever complained about this food," he murmured before devouring it in silence. James ate slowly, the warmth spreading through him, though the knot in his chest remained. Safety had been regained, but at the cost of freedom. Later that evening, Anna approached him as he sat alone in the courtyard. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in muted gold. "They are angry?" she asked, glancing toward the other men. "Some are," James admitted. "They feel like we gave up. Others are just relieved to be alive." "And you?" she pressed gently. James hesitated, staring at the cracked stones under his boots. "I don't know. I thought freedom meant going home, but maybe freedom is just surviving long enough to see tomorrow." Anna's eyes softened. "Tomorrow is all anyone here hopes for." They sat in silence, listening to the distant sounds of the town. A cart creaked over cobblestones, a child cried, a dog barked weakly. Life, fragile but persistent, carried on around them. That night, as the men settled into their beds, a new rhythm returned. Not the jubilant talk of going home, but the quieter relief of having survived another day. James lay awake, the blanket pulled to his chin, and thought of the strange twist of fate that had brought him back to the very place he once longed to escape. He did not know how long they would stay here, or what the future held. But for now, he knew this much. They were safe, and in a world still drowning in chaos, that was no small thing. The first days back at the hospital felt like a reprieve, but soon the cracks began to show. The townspeople had not forgotten that food, medicine, and space were limited, and now a band of returning prisoners consumed more than they contributed. Whispers reached James Whitaker's ears when he ventured beyond the gates. "They eat while our children starve," one woman muttered. Another spat on the ground as he passed. Inside the hospital walls, tension grew as well. The nurses remained professional, tending to wounds and offering meals, but their eyes betrayed weariness. Supplies dwindled quickly with so many mouths to feed. Every ladle of soup seemed thinner, every loaf of bread smaller. James noticed Anna working longer hours, her hands raw from scrubbing and stitching, her face pale with exhaustion. One evening, Miller voiced what many were thinking. "We can't just sit here like leeches," he said, staring at the half-empty bowl in his hands. "We'll lose their goodwill if we don't prove we're worth the trouble," Connors grunted. "And how do you suggest we do that?" "Build them a new town with our bare hands." "Maybe start by trying," Miller shot back. "Anything's better than waiting for them to turn us out." The discussion spread among the men. Some agreed with Miller, desperate to regain dignity. Others resisted, insisting it wasn't their job to rebuild the ruins of their enemy's land. The divide cut deep, threatening to fracture what little unity remained. That night, Anna found James in the courtyard staring at the cracked fountain. "The villagers are angry," she said quietly. "I've noticed," James replied. "They lost much," she continued. "Husbands, sons, homes. They see you eating, and it reminds them of what they no longer have. It is not hatred, only grief turned outward." James sighed. "Grief can still turn dangerous." Her gaze softened. "Yes. That is why you must show them you are not only taking but giving." The next day James gathered a few of the men willing to act. They cleared rubble from the courtyard, repaired broken shutters, and patched holes in the roof with scraps of wood. The work was clumsy but earnest. Villagers who passed by paused to watch, suspicion flickering into curiosity. Miller, sweat streaking his face, muttered, "Feels strange building up what we once came here to destroy." James answered, "Maybe that's exactly why it matters." Still, not all the prisoners joined. Some grumbled that the work was pointless. Others mocked James for bending to the will of former enemies. One accused him outright. "You're siding with them, Whitaker. Don't forget who we are." James faced him calmly. "I haven't forgotten. But surviving means more than filling our stomachs. It means proving we still have worth." The tension nearly boiled over one evening when villagers confronted the prisoners directly. A group of women stood at the gates demanding to know why their children went hungry while the Americans ate. Voices rose, sharp and accusing. One boy hurled a stone that struck the wall beside James. For a moment he feared violence would erupt again. Anna stepped forward, her voice firm. "These men are helping us now. They clear rubble, repair roofs, carry water. They do not take without giving." Her words carried weight, and though the villagers did not leave satisfied, they did leave without bloodshed. That night, James thanked her quietly. She only nodded. "Trust is built one act at a time," she said. James lay awake afterward, staring at the cracked ceiling beams. He knew she was right. Trust was fragile, like glass, shattered easily, repaired slowly. And here, in this place suspended between ruin and recovery, trust might be the only thing keeping them safe. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life inside the hospital began to change. The American prisoners were no longer just mouths to feed. They had become laborers, helpers, and, slowly, members of a wounded community trying to heal. James Whitaker felt the shift most clearly in the mornings, when villagers no longer looked at him with pure suspicion, but with cautious curiosity. Work filled their days. The prisoners repaired broken fences, dug gardens in ruined yards, and hauled stones from collapsed buildings. Miller, once quick with jokes, grew quieter as he carried timber alongside villagers, sweat soaking his shirt. Connors, too, surprised the others by teaching children how to mend simple tools, his gruff voice softening as he showed them how to tighten nails and sharpen blades. James often worked near Anna, who coordinated efforts with quiet authority. She assigned tasks, checked wounds, and still found time to tend to the sick. Watching her, James felt something unfamiliar, respect mixed with a bond he couldn't quite name. They had crossed from enemy lines into a place where roles blurred. She was no longer simply a German nurse. She was the person who had kept them alive, the voice that had warned them of dangers they hadn't wanted to see. One afternoon, while repairing a roof with 2 villagers, James paused to drink water. A man beside him, his face lined from years of hardship, spoke in halting English. "You help? Good?" James nodded, surprised. "We're just trying to do our part." The man looked at him with tired eyes. "War took my son, took my house. But maybe we build again." The words struck James deeply. For so long he had thought of home only in terms of his own loss, his family waiting in Ohio, the years stolen from him. But here was a man who had lost everything, and still he spoke of rebuilding. As the days passed, small gestures began to replace hostility. A villager brought eggs to the hospital kitchen, sharing them with both nurses and prisoners. Children, once kept away, started watching the Americans curiously, giggling when Miller clumsily tried to speak German words. One evening, the prisoners joined locals to patch the town well, and afterward, bread was broken among them. It was coarse and meager, but it was shared. Still, mistrust lingered beneath the surface. Some villagers muttered that the Americans were only working to earn better rations. Some prisoners grumbled that they were wasting effort on people who had once cheered the Reich. But each day of cooperation, however fragile, wove a thread of something stronger than necessity. One night, as James walked the courtyard, he found Anna sitting on the steps, her shoulders slumped with fatigue. He sat beside her, the air cool, stars faint above the cracked rooftops. "You've done much," she said softly. "The men, they work hard. The villagers see it." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's not enough. Some still look at us like we're intruders." Anna gave a faint smile. "Trust takes longer to grow than hatred. But it is growing, James. Do not doubt that." He looked at her, searching her face in the dim light. "You were right all along. About the road. About survival. If we hadn't listened—" She met his gaze steadily. "You listened when it mattered. That is enough." The silence between them carried no weight of enmity now, only the quiet understanding of 2 people bound by survival in the same broken world. As he returned to the barracks that night, James realized something had shifted inside him. He still longed for Ohio, for the fields of his youth, but he now understood that survival meant more than reaching home. It meant learning to build trust in places where trust had been burned to ash. Summer crept slowly into the Bavarian countryside. The ruins still stood, but green shoots pushed through cracked stones, and gardens planted by desperate hands began to bear fruit. Life, stubborn and fragile, refused to vanish. Inside the hospital, the rhythm of rebuilding continued. James Whitaker and the other prisoners had become part of it, their labor stitched into the daily survival of the village. One morning, distant rumbling announced the arrival of Allied patrols. Jeeps rolled through the streets, their engines loud against the silence of rubble. Soldiers in crisp uniforms surveyed the town, their flags stitched proudly to their sleeves. For the first time since leaving home, James heard his own language spoken freely by men in power. The news spread quickly. The war was not only over, but the region was now firmly under Allied control. Prisoners of war would be repatriated. They could return home at last. For many, the announcement was pure relief. Miller nearly wept as he gripped James's arm. "This is it, we're going home. No more fences, no more begging for scraps, just home." Connors, however, remained quiet. He studied the patrols with cautious eyes. "Home's waiting, sure," he muttered. "But don't think it'll be the same. Nothing's the same after all this. James felt the pull of two forces inside him. The thought of Ohio filled him with longing, the smell of fresh-cut hay, the sound of his father's voice, the sight of his mother waving from the porch. Yet as he looked around the hospital yard, at the villagers mending walls, at the children playing with sticks, at Anna handing out bread, he realized home was no longer a single place. Survival had tied him to this ground too. That evening, he spoke quietly with Anna by the garden they had helped plant. "The Allies want to send us back," he said, her hands stilled over the soil. She did not look up. "I knew this day would come." He hesitated. "I thought I'd feel only joy. But now, it feels complicated." Finally, she met his eyes. "Because you found something here." "Yes," James admitted. "Not just safety. A kind of purpose. We worked, we helped, we survived. It feels like another kind of freedom." Anna's expression was unreadable, but her voice was gentle. "I should go home, James. Your family waits. Your country waits." "And what about you?" he asked. "I stay," she said simply. "This is my home, even in ruins. These are my people." He wanted to argue, but he knew her truth was immovable. She had roots here, roots that even war could not tear out. Over the next days, the prisoners prepared to leave. Some were eager, already speaking of ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. Others were quieter, uncertain what awaited them after years away. James felt torn at every moment. Packing his few belongings felt like tearing away a piece of himself that had been grafted to this broken village. On their final evening, the villagers gathered with them in the courtyard. Bread and soup were shared, meager but given freely. For the first time there was laughter that did not sound forced. Children sat on the prisoners' laps, men and women shook their hands. The fragile peace they had built was real. As the gathering faded, James lingered with Anna near the fountain. The night was cool, the stars faint above. "You gave us more than you know," she said quietly. "Not just work. You gave us hope that enemies can be human." James felt his throat tighten. "And you gave us more than survival. You reminded us what it means to endure." They stood in silence, knowing words could not bridge what the world itself had torn apart. Soon he would leave. Soon she would stay. And between them would remain only the fragile bond of trust built in the ashes of war. The morning of departure arrived quietly, without celebration. The Allied trucks waited beyond the hospital gates, their engines rumbling, the smell of fuel drifting over the courtyard. The men stood in a line, their packs slung over their shoulders, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow. James Whittaker gripped the strap of his bag tightly, his heart thudding with the weight of leaving. Villagers gathered to watch them go. Some waved, others simply stood in silence, their expressions unreadable. Children clung to their mothers, their wide eyes following the men who had been both strangers and helpers. For weeks they had worked side by side, and though the war's scars still cut deep, something resembling trust had been planted. Miller nudged James lightly. "Hard to believe, huh?" "After everything, we're actually going home." James nodded but did not smile. "Home feels farther away now than it ever did." Connors, overhearing, gave a gruff laugh. "That's because we're not the same men who left it. We'll carry this place with us, whether we want to or not." When the time came to board the trucks, James found himself lingering near the gate. Anna stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her face calm but her eyes full of things unspoken. He walked to her slowly, the noise of the engines fading behind him. "I don't know how to thank you," James said. His voice was rough, his throat tight. "Without you, we'd never have made it." "You don't need to thank me," Anna replied softly. "You listened when it mattered." "That is thanks enough." For a moment they stood in silence, the distance between them filled with all the words they could not say. James wanted to promise he would return, that their bond would outlast borders and oceans, but he knew promises made in the ashes of war were fragile things. Instead he said, "Take care of yourself, and of them." Anna gave the faintest smile. "And you find your home again, you deserve it." James held her gaze one last time, then turned away, climbing into the truck as the guards called for them to move. The vehicle lurched forward, and through the dust he saw Anna grow smaller and smaller, standing at the gate until she was only a figure against the ruins. The road west looked different now. The ruins were still there, the scars unchanged, but James carried with him the memory of rebuilding, of hands joined in work instead of violence. Freedom, he realized, was not only the act of going home, it was also the choice to see humanity even in those once called enemies. Days later, as the trucks rolled into Allied camps, cheers erupted. Men shouted, laughed, and wept, clinging to one another in disbelief that the nightmare was truly over. But James remained quiet, his thoughts split between Ohio and Bavaria, between the family he longed to see and the people he had left behind. At night, lying beneath a clean blanket for the first time in years, he closed his eyes and saw the faces of both worlds. His mother's kind eyes, Anna's steady gaze, the villagers' cautious smiles. He realized then that survival was not only about reaching the end of the road, it was about carrying the weight of what had been endured and choosing not to let it harden the heart. The war was over, but its echoes would remain, and James knew he would never again think of freedom as something simple. Freedom was fragile, demanding, and always worth protecting, not just for himself, but for anyone who had endured the storm and still found the will to rebuild. If you've been moved by this journey of survival, resilience, and humanity, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories that deserve to be remembered. And don't stop here. Click on the video suggested on your screen to continue exploring the untold voices of history.